Hello history buffs. Today we start a series of videos about Bucha as the place where Russia first lost a battle. We hope you enjoy our work, so sit back and we'll tell you the story. Today we'll tell you about a key battle that changed the course of the war. It's the Battle of Hostomel Airport. Russian troops planned to take Kiev in 3 to 4 days. To do this, they planned to seize the Hostomel Airport and overthrow the central government. However, a number of mistakes and underestimation of the Ukrainian army led to the fact that the plan failed, and there was no plan B, so the occupier withdrew from the capital without entering it. American military experts told about the key defeat of the Russian Federation near Kiev. The battle for the Hostomel Airport was the first major battle of the Russian-Ukrainian War and its decisive event. This battle began on the morning of February 24, 2022, and lasted less than 36 hours. In the first hours of the Russian-Ukrainian War, Russian troops tried to capture a key airfield 20 kilometers from the center of the capital. They were to be followed by additional airborne battalions on transport planes. They were to deploy quickly, take control of Kiev, overthrow the government or force it to flee. In the end, Russia gained control of the airport but was unable to land airborne troops on airplanes. Conscripts of the Ukrainian National Guard, supported by artillery units, were able to hold off elite Russian airborne troops long enough to prevent the Russian military from using the airfield as an air bridge to quickly seize the Ukrainian capital. Russia's main goal was to capture Kiev within 3 to 4 days. Vladimir Putin believed that if the Russian military could reach the capital quickly enough, President Vladimir Zelensky and his government would capitulate, the population would be subdued, and a pro-Russian regime would be installed before effective resistance could be mobilized or the international community had time to react. This is undoubtedly why some senior U.S. officials believed in the run-up to the war that Kiev could fall within 72 hours. Russia attempted a coup in the Ukrainian leadership with Operation Hostomel as its centerpiece. The Russian leadership planned a decapitation offensive that relied on speed of action but involved significant risk to the forces involved. Instead of a joint force operation, the main objective of which was to destroy the Ukrainian armed forces, Russia attempted a coup within the Ukrainian leadership, the centerpiece of which was Operation Hostomel. At the same time, large incursions by maneuver forces in other directions were intended to cause paralysis in the Ukrainian armed forces. The operation was conceived as a counterweight to extensive sabotage and infiltration activities. The Russian leadership expected that much of the Ukrainian resistance could be incapacitated from within. Moscow assumed that it would not have to fight most of the Ukrainian armed forces in the conventional way, and that once the capital was taken, some of the armed forces would be incapacitated or easily isolated. This high-risk, high-stakes strategy was quite typical, given the number of similar operations in Russian and Soviet history, including Operation Danube in 1968, Storm 333 in 1979, the capture of Pristina Airport in 1999, and the airborne airlift to Simferopol Airport during the 2014 takeover of Crimea. In general, it repeated previous stereotypical regime change operations. The risky approach to seizing the capital was also reminiscent of the failed attempt to take Grozny in 1994, when a multilateral assault in the center of the city ended in failure during the First Chechen War. Russian operations often used the seizure of a major airbase as an initial step, followed by a rapid buildup of airborne forces, which then attempted to consolidate political leadership and set the stage for a larger ground force operation. Prior to the invasion, Russian intelligence deployed spies to Kiev and its suburbs, including Irpin and Bucha. All three of us conducted field research in Ukraine and learned from interviews that a massive infiltration and support operation was conducted prior to the invasion, the purpose of which was to provide Russian airborne troops and special operations forces quick access to the capital. These pro-Russian saboteurs marked landing zones, attempted to secure infrastructure, and performed other support tasks. Russian military strategy assumed that the special services in Ukraine had created all the conditions for a lightning attack that would paralyze the Ukrainian leadership. However, this did not happen. Russian intelligence greatly overestimated its capabilities, as Ukrainian intelligence and police were able to neutralize important elements of the Russian network in preparation for the operation. In addition, the Russian units carrying out the invasion were apparently ill-informed about the plans and contours of the operation. Many were surprised that their initial deployment on the border, for exercises, evolved into a complex large-scale invasion scheme with tight timelines and multiple lines of attack. The Ukrainian military assumed that the Russian attack would focus on the Donbass, rather than a large-scale invasion of the entire country, and positioned its forces accordingly. As a result, Both sides were somewhat surprised by what they faced on the day the war began. Russian intelligence greatly overestimated its capabilities, as Ukrainian intelligence and police were able to neutralize important elements of the Russian network in preparation for the operation. Russia's operational plan called for a rapid airborne assault on Hostomel Airport, a simultaneous mechanized assault on Kiev from Belarus on the western side of the Dnieper and from Russia on the eastern side of the river. The Hostomel military airfield and base, also known as Antonov Airport, is located near the town of Hostomel, Kiev Oblast, about 20 kilometers northwest of the center of Kiev with a pre-war population of about 17,500. The military airbase included a 3,500-meter-long runway capable of accommodating the largest transport aircraft, several dozen single-story and multi-story buildings, some as high as 6 stories, and 2 large hangars. To the southeast of the runway was the base of the 4th Rapid Reaction Brigade of the National Guard of Ukraine. We believe that the Russian military chose Hostomel because of its large runway, location along the route of the mechanized forces advance, defensible terrain around the airfield, and likely weaker defenses than other nearby airfields, which would allow a small strike group to capture and hold the airfield long enough for reinforcements to arrive by air or ground. It was armed with Mi-8 transport helicopters designed to carry airborne troops, Ka-52 Alligator attack helicopters and several older Mi-24 attack helicopters. The Russian paratroopers included about 34 helicopters and between 200 and 300 Russian paratroopers from the 31st Guards Airborne Assault Brigade and the 45th Independent Guards Special Forces Brigade. Both units were part of the Russian Airborne Troops, VDV. They were armed with Mi-8 transport helicopters designed to carry airborne troops, Ka-52 Alligator attack helicopters and several older Mi-24 attack helicopters. The paratroopers landed from the VD airport, Bolshoi Bakov, in Belarus, about 170 kilometers north of Hostomel. The mission was to capture the airport and create an air bridge to support the assault on the capital. We believe that the Russian military counted on minimal resistance in Hostomel, as there were only a small number of Ukrainian troops left to defend the capital. The 72nd Mechanized Brigade, which was tasked with the defense of Kiev, was still en route from its garrison south of the city. Although many Ukrainian units had begun moving the day before, by the time the Air Mobile Strike Group arrived in Hostomel they had not yet had time to take up their planned defensive positions. Thus, on the morning of the attack, about 200 soldiers of the 4th Rapid Reaction Brigade of the National Guard of Ukraine remained to defend the airport. The Rapid Reaction Brigade is a new unit organized according to NATO standards, combining light infantry, tanks, artillery and reconnaissance drones. Ukraine expected Russia's main effort to be concentrated in the Donbass, so most of the brigade was moved to the southeast. The 200 men left to guard the airfield are mostly recruits and rear echelon troops, not combat soldiers. As infantry, tanks, artillery, and drones were withdrawn to the east, small arms, old portable Igla surface-to-air missile systems, and at least one towed 23x152 MZU-23-2 anti-aircraft launcher remained to defend the airfield. In addition, the airfield was supported from the air by 2 Ukrainian Su-24M bombers and 2 MiG-29 fighters. The remaining handful of officers resembled rear administrators more than fighters. Nevertheless, this small group had a huge responsibility for the airfield's defense. Ukraine had the largest radar-guided ground-based air defense network in Europe, inherited from the Soviet Union. It consisted of 3 brigades and 2 regiments of S-300PS, PT systems, AS-300V1 Brigade, 2 Buk M1 brigades, several modernized S-12 systems, and a suite of OSA and modernized Tor short-range air defense systems. The air defense network, combined with the skill of the operators, was perhaps the most powerful the Russian Air Force has had to face in decades. The Russian air and space forces were responsible for suppressing and neutralizing this network, but according to analysts, the air and space forces were generally weak at dynamically targeting enemy air defense systems and assessing their combat damage in a timely manner. Therefore, they used a static engagement plan, striking predetermined targets at predetermined times. Thus, many of the Russian missile strikes on the morning of the day of the attack hit stationary facilities and predetermined targets, missing many Ukrainian air defense systems that had begun moving the day before. We believe that because of this, the initial Russian offensive was far less successful than the military had anticipated. The Russians began the attack on February 24 with pre-attack strikes on the city, the airbase, and the infiltration corridor. Around 6 to 7 a.m., two 3M14 caliber cruise missiles struck Hostomel Airport, but were ineffective. One of them did not hit the barracks but turned around a nearby field. The second flew into an apartment building. Russian air and space forces managed to suppress only some of the Ukrainian air defenses. Other attacks targeted Ukrainian command and control, leaving the Ukrainian Air Force to challenge air superiority. The Russian air and space forces created a corridor for the air attack by successfully jamming some Ukrainian radars and damaging or suppressing two large air defense sites, providing cover for the Dnieper River north of the city. With Ukrainian air defenses weakened, the Russian helicopters crossed the Belarusian border and entered Ukrainian airspace at about 9:30 a.m. They flew along the Dnieper River at an altitude of 1,000 meters. They flew along the Dnieper River at low altitude to avoid Ukrainian radars, which may have remained operational. They remained undetected until they approached the Kiev hydroelectric dam north of Kiev at about 10:30 a.m. After they were spotted, Ukrainian anti-aircraft units shot down the two lead helicopters near the dam. The damaged Ka-52 made an emergency landing near the riverbank, while the stricken Mi-24 fell into the river. The escort helicopters released heat traps and avoided further losses. At about 11 a.m., the strike group approached the Hostomel Airport. As it approached, the attack helicopters turned north to engage targets at the airfield, while the transport helicopters turned south, planning to land paratroopers and secure the barracks and airfield facilities. The Ukrainian commander, Lieutenant Andriy Kulish, 36, was unaware of the approach of the helicopters until he heard the noise of their propeller blades. Minutes later, the sound of the rotors was drowned out by rocket and machine gun fire from the attack helicopters. But the resistance was tougher than the Russians had expected. Kulish had sent his small force to defend the airfield as early as that morning. About 20 Ukrainian National Guard fighters defended the radar station at the northern end of the airfield with Zu-23 to 2 anti-aircraft guns, while the rest, including several squads of National Guard reinforcements that had been sent to defend the airfield earlier in the morning, defended the airfield from fighting positions to the south of the airfield. The Ukrainian military also moved large trucks and other equipment to the airfield to make it unusable for airplanes to take off and land. National Guard recruits did not immediately make themselves known. When one of the Ka-52 helicopters was making a strafing run, one of the soldiers tried to hit it with his 9K-38 Igla infrared guided surface-to-air missile system, but the Russian helicopter was too close. As the helicopter flew past, he took it in his sights again and fired. The direct hit sent the helicopter crashing onto the runway, inadvertently creating another obstacle for transport planes to land. The successful engagement caused morale to rise among the Ukrainian fighters. Recruits from the rear echelons began to believe that they could indeed successfully fight the Russians. This was the first, but not the last helicopter these soldiers shot down. Over the next 2 hours, National Guard fighters using manpads, anti-aircraft guns and small arms shot down 2 more Ka-52s and 1 Mi-8. Despite resistance, the Russians eventually moved about 300 airborne forces soldiers to the airfield in 2 waves of 10 helicopters each. Once on the ground, the soldiers, armed only with small arms, machine guns, and portable anti-tank rifles, advanced to seize the airfield and surrounding structures. Although these particular airborne forces units had been regularly trained to land from helicopters, there is no evidence that the Russian units knew of the plan in advance or had time to practice it. The flat airfield also provided little shelter for Russian soldiers, whose numbers were too small compared to the forces needed to control an airbase of this size. Ukrainian National Guard fighters, who were running low on ammunition, had entrenched themselves in the area of the cantonment point just before the Russian troops entered and were preparing to withdraw, having exhausted their main ammunition supply. For some reason, the National Guard conscripts were unable to take with them the ammunition needed for a long battle. Nevertheless, the Ukrainian National Guard soldiers conducted a purposeful withdrawal through a relatively narrow street of the airbase and were able to leave with little or no casualties. The Ukrainians claim that there were no fatalities or serious injuries during the battle. The fact that they were able to get away so easily supports this claim, as they did not have to slow down to evacuate the wounded. The 20 enlisted men guarding the radar on the northern edge of the base, on the other hand, were less fortunate. Surrounded only by fields with no hidden escape routes, they became some of the first POWs. Around 1300, nearly 2 hours after the battle began, the Russians finally gained a foothold on the airfield, but their position remained precarious. The helicopters returned to Belarus, and the airborne soldiers, lacking tanks and artillery, had to defend the airbase with limited air support, possibly 2 Su-25 attack aircraft, until reinforcements arrived. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces were mobilizing and had a decisive advantage in the fighting around the capital. The first Russian reinforcements were to arrive by air. This force consisted of about 1,000 soldiers who had been airlifted from an airbase in Pskov, Russia, located about 2 hours' flight from Hostomel. Earlier in the day, this force was loaded onto 18 Il-76 transport planes and appeared to be on its way to Hostomel, but when it became clear that the Russians could not quickly capture and secure the airfield, the flight was aborted. This was a watershed moment in the emerging battle, but the reason why the Russian paratroopers abandoned their reinforcement plan is unclear. It may have been due to Ukrainian artillery shelling of the airfield, rendering it unusable, or the general inability of the Russian airborne forces to control the airfield. Alternatively, the Russian military may have feared the loss of the Il-76 due to Ukrainian air defense after 6 to 7 helicopters were lost during the assault. The second group of Russian reinforcements were mechanized and armored troops advancing on Kiev from Belarus along the western bank of the Dnieper River. After the first Russian mechanized troops crossed the Ukrainian border at 4 a.m. on February 24, they had only about 130 kilometers of highway to travel to reach Kiev. The Russian plan probably assumed that either transport planes or mechanized troops would reach the airport by late afternoon, but neither happened. The advancing mechanized troops faced difficulties fighting in a narrow corridor through Chernobyl and Ivankov, which meant that the Russian airborne troops would be on their own for the first night. Thanks for watching. In the second part of this video, we will talk about how the Ukrainian army conducted a counterattack and liberated an entire region, breaking the strategy of the Russians. If you liked this video, please like, subscribe and give us your opinion on these events in the comments. Your reactions motivate us to keep creating content.